I was not excited to read Atomic Habits. And in fact, I was reluctant. I bought it and it sat on my bookshelf for months. I hate to admit the reason why. I'll say first the reason why I ended up reading it, which is I totally did get peer pressured by the reading community because it is such a mainstream book that I felt like I had to read it. That's why I bought it in the first place. The reason why I didn't want to read it is because most of the people I hear talking about it are usually men, which presents a bias for me in the first place, unfortunately. And also from men that I wouldn't necessarily take life advice from. So that was my perception of the author. I like to guide my life in a very intuitive way and not so much a strenuous and analytical way. Although that being said, David Goggins' book is like my second favorite book ever. Whatever, I read it, and as I started reading it, I realized why I was reading it, and I totally had the wrong idea about the contents of the book. Simply because my definition for my own habits was wrong. I was thinking like, fuck, I'm gonna read this book and then I'm gonna feel like I have to force myself to be up at the crack of dawn and doing all the things that I have done before. I didn't want the added pressure, which that's just lazy to admit. But as I started reading it, I realized what my habits really were. And so that brings me to the quote-unquote thesis that I pulled from the book, which is small changes don't add up, they compound. So that's kind of his thesis / I guess the slogan for this book. And also part of that thesis is every action is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. So Atomic Habits has that name for a reason because of how minuscule these habits actually are. And the purpose is that if you change enough of the minuscule habits, they don't just add up, they compound. Yeah, so it's like exponential change every time you make a tiny change. It's actually like every single one of your mannerisms is a habit. And more broadly, on an identity level and on a spiritual level, I find it so important to be aware of the minuscule beliefs so that you can actually make a conscious decision about whether you do agree with these things that we've been taught, either from our families or by society. Taking these lessons and bringing them into an intuitive level is what I was able to pull out of this experience reading this book. There are a couple lines for me that were heavy hitters, and I made a TikTok about this. The number one that I just loved is winners and losers have the same goals. Period. Winners and losers have the same goal, so it's not the goal that makes you special, it's the mundane that makes you special. It's the mundane where your true identity comes out. Who are you when you get bored? And who are you when there is no motivation left? That zooms out to a much bigger concept that I've been thinking about, and actually something that I learned through the David Goggins book, which is the difference between discipline and will. I will say I was scared, or I didn't want to read this book because I thought it was a book about discipline, and I have totally removed that word from my vocabulary. I think that's an ugly word, and I think it's been weaponized by the same people who talk about this book. And I understand discipline in such a different way when I reframed it to being my will. What is the balance between my will and God's will for my life, so that when I do hit levels of low motivation or boredom, I am still kick-started by will, my drive, my relentless need to be myself and fulfill my identity. So that brings me to this next quote from the book. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Something that I've learned in my spirituality journey is the number one step, the very first step in anything regarding this is paying attention. The self-awareness. And just when you think you attain a new level of self-awareness, you get called out. That's what happened to me in this book, because as I was reading it, I was discovering my minuscule habits that never would have come to my conscious mind unless I was directly analyzing myself. It's not until we can consciously pluck it that we can even decide to make changes about it. If we don't make a conscious effort to re-examine and re-decide what we want our lives to be made up of, we are at will of anything and anyone else but ourselves. This ties into what I believe he was beginning to talk about as the war for your attention. James Clear says, the greatest threat to success is not failure, but boredom. And as we talked about earlier, your true identity projects when you're bored, in your low moments. Machiavelli said, men desire novelty to such an extent that those who are doing well wish for change as much as those who are doing badly. Bruh, do you want to know when Machiavelli was alive? The 1500s. Can you imagine what was happening then for him to say that? Lord, if only he knew what would come of us now. And I've heard this so much in the meditation world that there's a quote that floats around. Your ability to achieve success is your success is determined by your ability to focus. But we can never get enough. And I guess that's why the phone frying our brains is so bad. I guess that's why the dopamine hit is just so horrible. And I listened to this podcast recently. It was Jay Shetty podcast, but he had a doctor on that explained the differences between dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, and estrogen. And that also kind of blew my mind, because he was like, all these words kind of float around and they're buzzwords now, which is crazy. But we all know that the scrolling on TikTok is like dopamine hits. What we don't know is the function for dopamine is motivation. So you also get dopamine when you make your bed in the morning. And you also get dopamine when you do something hard. So dopamine is what motivates you to continue doing the action. I hope that makes sense. So like when you are on your phone and you can't stop scrolling and you cannot for the life of you force yourself to get up, it's because of like that chemical reaction that's actually happening in your brain. It's not just a cute thing like my phone makes me happy, TikTok makes me happy, and I get dopamine. It's like cha-ching, cha-ching. It's like, no, it's a chemical reaction going on in your brain that's inhibiting you from leaving it. Because when we are given such an abundant resource of dopamine, there's no need for inner reflection. There's no need for like inner analysis. I mean, when people say your attention is your currency, it's not because the most views gets the most money. It's not because engagement equals money. It's because we as people literally can't afford to give away more attention. Our lives can't afford more attention off of it than already is. Atomic Habits, because every single micro detail actually counts. And every single micro detail is actually indicative of your identity. And every single micro detail has the ability to be changed and to be defined by you. But it's like we missed that part of the story at some point. Nobody told us that. But it's the real people who can like stand up and take autonomy over themselves that have any amount of power or harmony in their lives, in their experience, and what they decide to make of their lives. Your success is determined by your ability to concentrate on yourself. And it's interesting because that is the teaching of meditation. And I've read many books about spirituality, and this one is more like psychology driven, which is why I also appreciate this perspective. But it's funny, they all say the same thing, just in a different way. The last part that kind of blew my mind, that I think applied to me so much, is the concept of motion versus action. So for example, motion is reading Atomic Habits. Motion is researching. And motion is setting yourself up for success. That's not the action. And the amount of motion doesn't matter. Really, at a certain point, motion is redundant because it saturates, and all that's left to be done is the action. But the action is the scary part. What actionable steps are happening here to work towards my goal? And how am I in motion, just kind of like jogging around the goal? You know what I mean? But other than that, let's think. My goal was to start waking up with one alarm. And since starting this book, I have made a lot of progress on that. And to wrap it up, let's just reconclude with the thesis. Every action is a vote for the type of person you wish to become. Small changes don't add up, they compound. And I will leave you with this bonus quote. When successful people fail, they rebound quickly. You prove me wrong, Gym Bros.